Great to be here with you guys. My name is Benjamin Bellarado. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona down in Tucson. And today I'm going to be talking with you about kind of the last component of my dissertation research. So over the last few years, more than I'd like to admit, I've been talking to people at Pecos about sandals, sandal imagery, especially in rock imagery, petroglyphs and pictographs, but then also in Kiva murals that I've been dating. But kind of going, putting the cart before the horse, but in the last couple of years I've been looking at the actual sandals, and these things are incredible. So I'm really excited to talk with you guys today about some of the preliminary results that I've been coming across. So twined yucca sandals, they're really interesting, and I wish I had a PowerPoint. I can show you some slides later, maybe if you give me a couple beers. But twined yucca sandals were made and used from about the Basket-Maker II period until about 1250 AD. So basically, they start being produced about 100 AD based on work that Laurie Webster's done. They continue and kind of reach their technical complexity in the Basket-Maker III period, and of course, Kelly Hayes Gilpin has done a lot of work looking at those. But then the development after Basket-Maker III into the end of their use, about 1250, really hasn't been studied in any depth until now. So these sandals, throughout the history of their use, they're really the pinnacle of ancestral Pueblo weaving technologies. They're the most complex types of weave structures that we find in any type of textile, or especially in garments, really even until the modern era. They were incredibly complex to weave. They were really expensive to make. Each one of these sandals has over 250 foot of single-ply cordage in them. Really, really fine stuff. Some of it's like a millimeter thick, maybe a couple of millimeters. And then those, of course, are doubled and tripled over into the warps and wefts of the structure of the sandal. And that really continues throughout their use, or throughout the period when they're used. But then there are some stylistic variations that happen and change over time that are really significant. Now, like I said, these later versions of these sandals that I'm focusing on haven't been studied in any detail until now. But there are several large collections that we have, mainly that were collected between about the 1890s and the late 1930s. Now, these collections come from Pueblo Bonito, Aztec ruins, Canyon del Muerto, southeastern Utah, Antelope House, and Mesa Verde. So we have a pretty good distribution across the San Juan Basin, at least. So there's about 300 of these known later versions of the twined yucca sandals. And I've looked at about 200 of these to date, going to museums both in the Southwest, the West, and then also on the East Coast. Let's see here. So let's just start off and say that, like I said, the Basket-Maker III examples have been studied in detail, and they often have what we call a scallop toe or a round toe, and then a puckered heel. But over time, that changes, and that really seems to continue into the Pueblo I time period. We don't really know a whole lot about what Pueblo I twined sandals look like because they're often come from open air sites as opposed to alcoves where they preserve. Of course, later on, we find them in great houses and alcoves, so they preserve there too. But these Pueblo I examples are kind of an enigma. But recently, I looked at basically all of the twined sandals from Pueblo Bonito. There's about 45 or so. We can actually see this kind of development over time when these major stylistic attributes changed and developed. So in the earliest parts of Pueblo Bonito, from about the 860s or so, depending on whose dates, who's pushing the dates further and further back, from the northern burial cluster and then also from the western cluster, the earliest components of Pueblo Bonito, we have a continuation of this Basket-Maker III kind of style of twined sandals. They have puckered heels and then either round or scallop toes, and then this zoned layout. But sometime after about the 1060s, and we know this because we find these sandals in rooms that we know post-date the 1060s, we start to see a pretty significant change. We start to see shaping of the sandals, left to right, instead of both being the same shape. And then sometime after 1060 also, we see the development of this really iconic toe jog. And I'm sure all of you guys have, if you imagine a sandal in the Southwest, you imagine this toe jog. Well, that really doesn't seem to come in until about the 1060s. So another major development that happens over that time from Pueblo I to early Pueblo II is that these sandals seem to become more restricted in their use. Who can have them? we find many fewer than we had in the Basket Maker 3 period, and they seem to be more restricted to Chaco great houses and great houses communities, and then post-Chaco and great houses. We don't really see them in these small kind of, regular, run-of-the-mill regular houses, really in just these kind of special communal contexts. Now, over that time, we see that there's a lot of consistency that happens. Basically, they go from fairly diverse, where each pair of sandals is identical left to right, but no two sandals or no two pair of sandals are exactly alike. Well, that really seems to change in the Pueblo II period. We start to see the development of these really uniform styles. One thing that continues is that their use is marked by an incredible amount of wear. Almost every single example I've seen of these have holes worn through the heel, and often they're even more worn than that. It looks like they're really, probably at the end of their use life, had to be strapped onto your foot. They wouldn't have stayed on, but people kept using them. And to me, that suggests they probably only got one pair. Whoever the wearers were probably only got one pair maybe in their whole life. They're also really standardized in size, which is really interesting. Now, across the entire region, about 95% of the sandals that I have a full measure on, like I said, sometimes the heel's missing, but when you have a full measure, they're always within 1 centimeter of 26 centimeters, either 25 or 27. 95% of them. So that tells you there's a lot of standardization. And I really wonder how they're doing that. We have these sandalasts, we call them sandalasts, these rocks that are shaped like sandals, but the size of those varies quite a bit, so they're not using that as a template. But regardless, it's really interesting because those are really large. They're larger on average than the other types of sandals that are maybe easier to make. Plated sandals you could make between, I've seen people make replicas in 5 minutes, maybe an hour or so. But these twine ones, maybe they took a week per sandal. But anyway, so they're much larger. So that tells us that they're probably intended for people with larger feet in a community. Now, if we look at, a cross-section of biologic diversity, who has the biggest feet in any community? Usually it's mature men, right? So that's one potential, is that maybe they're used mainly by men. But another thing to think about is they're not made to order. They don't measure the size of Joe's foot or Sue's foot and then make them to fit that. They're this really standardized size. So it makes you also wonder, who's using these things? I don't really have a really good answer yet. So another interesting development that occurred is really about the 1100s. And of course, the dating of these sandals right now is really dependent on the context from which they come, and sometimes that we have better or worse information on that. But about 1100, we see a shared style between the southeast wing of Pueblo Bonito, which dates to about the 1100s, and then at Aztec ruins. And there's a dominant style, basically these really incredible sandals with isolated diamonds or isolated triangle shapes, basically laid out across the entire surface. They're not in zones anymore of the designs. They also have toe jogs, and it's this shared style between these two really, primary sites in the Chaco and post-Chaco system, which is really interesting. So at Aztec, it's about 80% of the about 60 sandals that come from Aztec that I've looked at have this same tread or same design. They also have low visibility attributes that are shared, like the heel finish seems to be a really important characteristic in identifying communities. What else is really interesting with the shared style between Aztec and Chaco is that small frequencies of these same sandals show up in the other assemblages. So in southeastern Utah, in northeastern Arizona. And they're very different when I've started, like I said, be able to recognize these kind of local styles. So it becomes really obvious when there's one that's not from around there. And so that really could go a long way to helping us understand the spread of the Chaco system, and then also after the reorganization of Chaco, how the post-Chaco system, the Aztec system, if we want to think about it that way, how that spread and developed. We often talk about emulation versus immigration. Are people from Chaco or from the center of this system, are they going out to these other outlier great houses and telling them what to do, how to do things, or are people just copying? I think it is probably a mix of that for sure. But what these sandals show us is that there are definitely people from Aztec Chaco, maybe that shared system, whatever that was, that went to these outlying communities. Now, what they did there, that's up for debate. We can look at other types of attributes like architecture and pottery to tell us how shared those connections were. But people definitely went there. And the wear on these sandals looks like, maybe people are dancing, but they also could be walking there. And it could be evidence of people walking these great distances. So there's kind of a hole in the data between about the 1100s and the 1200s where we don't have a lot of twine sandals. And part of this is because we have kind of a different kind of preservation, different kind of record from these post-Chaco and gray houses. But I can tell you that there is a new kind of tier of complexity that develops. So I often look at these sandals, and like I said, I'm focusing on this one style, but you have to kind of, spread a broader brush to understand how they fit into the bigger picture. So for every, 10 or 20 of these coarse-plated sandals that are really kind of run-of-the-mill, everybody, or quite a few people probably had them, for every 10 of those, you have one fine-plated sandal. And for every 10 fine-plated sandals, you have one of these twine sandals I'm telling you about. But after 1100, we start to see in very small frequencies and other assemblages this next kind of level of complex. They're even fancier than these regular twine sandals. So for about every 10 of those, you have one of these complex ones. And how are they complex? Well, they're trichrome often. They have 3 different colors woven into them. They often integrate some type of cotton-based technology, so either twill twining or slit tapestry techniques. They often have cotton toe straps or heel straps, and they have these raised treads as well. But some of them don't have the raised treads. That's a really common theme in the twine sandals, but this kind of new level of complexity, it almost seems like they're less concerned with leaving their mark in the sand. Maybe they're just kind of above that system or beyond it or something, but the sandals seem to become more visible as well. And I think this is really important because it fits in pretty well with what we think about is happening in the beginning of the Pueblo III period, and then it's moved to the middle Pueblo III, where basically this whatever this Chaco system was, it starts to fragment and reorganize, and these smaller communities seem to take on these kind of more isolated roles. There's maybe less foreign exchange. We have the buildup, especially in the northern San Juan, of these tri-walls and bi-walls, D-shaped structures, but in these kind of confederacies, as I think is the term Donna Glowacki's used. And so it seems like maybe these extra special twine sandals kind of correspond with maybe the leaders of those systems. It looks like there is increasing hierarchy we see in these other types of material remains from that time period, and I think these sandals really fit in well with that. So I don't want to say kings like Steve Lexon might, but they're definitely, the high priest, the high priestess, some type of elevated leader above just the normal elite footwear that everybody else is, or that you see in these other twine sandals. So over the development of the Pueblo III period, by 1200, we start to see they take on kind of a new life. Like I said, in the Pueblo II, there's this standardization with the Chaco and the Aztec kind of style. But then especially in southeastern Utah, we see the development of much more variable design attributes and also weaving techniques that go with those. Become much more variable. The tread designs, in particular, on the bottom of these sandals, seem to become much bolder and much denser. And the density actually seems to mirror what we see on Pueblo III pottery, so the design styles or the designs basically become much more packed. You almost have more black than white, right? Well, we see that with the raised treads on these sandals as well. Let's see here. So then this is especially true in southeastern Utah. One thing that people often ask me is about the toe jogs. Like I said, that's this really iconic thing that we talk about quite often. And it's become kind of thought of as a symbol of this kind of Chaco or post-Chaco system. And I think Polly Shasma's written about these. Of course, Patty Crown also has addressed that. But looking across this bigger data set, I can tell you that the toe jog was really the main thing in this Chaco Aztec style. But as you head kind of counterclockwise, across the southwest, the toe jog frequencies diminish. So by the time you get to southeastern Utah, only about a third of them have toe jogs. And by the time you get down to Chinle Wash, only about 10% or so have them. And they might be these foreign exchanges from the other outside the basin. So anyway, so we see this changing of these styles, and that can tell us a lot about social organization, and who was moving across the Southwest, who is associated with whom. So interestingly, by 1250, these sandals really drop out. They drop out of murals, they drop out of the rock imagery where we can find those, and they're replaced, or at least there's a continued use of these more coarsely created sandals, the plated sandals. They keep using those, but stop this kind of really visible marker of social hierarchy. And then by 1300, sandals really fall out of the record completely, and they're replaced by moccasins. And that could tell us a lot about this major social changes taking place between the end of the occupation of the San Juan Basin and this depopulation and reorganization in the public floor. But that amount of time. Thank you.